Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the first weekend of October 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll recap the vice presidential debate and look at this week's election news. We'll hear about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, and we'll discuss our reporting on the dock workers' strike and its impacts. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the presidential race this week, including a vice presidential debate, it's Dan McCaleb.
Saturday marks exactly 1 month before the November 5th election, when voters will decide whether former President Donald Trump or Vice President Kamala Harris succeeds Joe Biden as president. The race remains tight both nationally and in key swing states ahead of the election. This week marked the first and only debate between the vice presidential candidates, Ohio U.S. Senator J.D. Vance running with Trump and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz running with Harris. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you covered the debate for the Center Square. What are your top takeaways?
The first question is, do vice presidential debates matter? Are there some undecided swing voter, a couple in Pennsylvania watching the TV this week, really being influenced by this debate? And, I've seen a lot of analysis, a lot of writing that's skeptical of that, but I actually think it does make a difference because, for instance, Harris and Walz have made their whole campaign about the vibes, the joy campaign, low on details, high on joy and good vibes. And the VP debate definitely changed the vibes of the race. I mean, Vance, who is previously being constantly critiqued as weird and super extreme, just this weird, extreme right-winger, he seemed like a very normal, well-spoken, eloquent guy. I mean, he may have come off as almost like too eloquent to some people, but he didn't come off as that weird or guy in your basement or a guy you don't want to talk to at the grocery store. So I think he did a lot. And the favorability ratings after the race showed that he did a lot for his own personal brand that repaired it. Except for that, question at the end about January 6th, he pretty much dominated Walz, and everyone, and a lot of Democrats admitted that. Now, will it significantly move the needle? No, but the thing is, Dan, as you alluded to, these races have razor thin margins right now. I mean, we're talking the key swing states are within the margin of error. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. These states are within the margin of error polling, and so they're legitimately toss-ups. If we had the election today, we do not know who would win. And so, swinging a few thousand or a few, tens of thousands of voters with a good debate performance could make the difference.
Yeah, when it comes to vice presidential debates, whether they actually make a difference, the honest answer is I don't know. Who knows? There's a lot of speculation about it, but there is no doubt that J.D. Vance dominated most of this debate, as you said, until the very end. One of the interesting things, Tim Walz was asked about his claims that he was, in China during Tiananmen Square massacre. He was asked about that. He called himself, what did he call himself?
Knucklehead.
A knucklehead, and then conceded that he misspoke, which he's done a lot during this campaign season. He misspoke about his military record, et cetera, et cetera. That was not a good moment for the Minnesota governor.
No, I mean, how many times can you misspeak on important issues before you're considered just a liar? I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of Republicans do consider him a liar. A lot of, high-ranking military retired officers have come out and been highly critical of Walz for embellishing his rank in the military, which is kind of a funny thing to embellish because it's so easily disproven. but he's embellished his rank. And then he basically said that he carried weapons of war into combat. We intimated that, and that wasn't true. He never, he left his place in the military just before his unit was deployed to Afghanistan, actually. So, I mean, that's, that didn't get brought up, and it's probably to his benefit, because I was on a press call this week before the debate with the Trump campaign and, other national reporters, and they dedicated a lot of time on that call to attacking Walz for his military deception, his military record deception. In fact, the password to get on the call was stolen valor. So they were really making that point. So the fact that Walz alluded that criticism was good for him. I think that Walz looked really bad on immigration in particular and the economy. I mean, Vance was very prepared. My sense, Dan, was that Walz was very prepared to attack Trump, and he had his lines down and he was clipping through those lines and making his one-liners, but he was not prepared at all to defend Harris. So he got his lines in against Trump. And then Vance had prepared defenses for Trump, and then Vance would turn and attack Kamala Harris's record, and Walz just had no answer for it. And so I think that maybe was the missed opportunity in their preparation, is Walz was not able to play defense for Harris. I mean, the attacks on Trump, there's plenty to be found, and they've been repeated in the media and by Democrats for a long time. There's no shortage of attacks on Trump, but defenses of Harris's record seemed more rare at that debate.
So let's push it forward, Casey, in the short time we have left. Tomorrow, Saturday, October 5th, is the 1 month mark until the election. It's October. In past election cycles, you've heard of these October surprises, the potential for October surprises that could swing a tight race such as this. And this is a very tight race, according to most polls, including the Real Clear polling average of all polls. What potentially could swing this race one way or the other? Yeah,
I mean, it's so interesting that it's, as I said, it's razor thin margins. Something will swing it. I mean, we have a couple of things happening right now. The dock workers, strike that closed down the ports on the East and the Gulf Coast has been tentatively reached an agreement. So, I mean, that is a huge liability removed for Harris. And that was going to be potentially campaign ending for her as prices continued to rise and she continued to take fire on it being unable to reach a deal. But so far, they were able to get it. Biden or whoever got under the table. Now, if that deal falls through, it could be catastrophic for Harris. It would need to fall through pretty quickly so that the prices would have time to rise. Another one, Dan, is if there is some kind of major escalation in the Middle East, I think it has a real chance to be an October surprise for Harris as well. Of course, that's escalating. If there is something that entangles the United States in another foreign Middle East war where people are talking about putting troops on the ground, it changes the calculus because voters are now asking a new question. They're not asking, what do I think about abortion rights or what do I think about democracy or the economy or immigration? They're asking, who do I trust to handle this war in the Middle East? And we really don't know who fares better on that question, Trump or Harris.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners over the next month plus can keep up with all election-related news at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, it's our Eliana Krunoval.
Hurricane Helene caused severe damage across the southeastern United States earlier this week. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Alan Wooten. Alan, where all saw the greatest impact of this storm?
Well, we had two particular regions that got hit. First was the Big Bend region of Florida, where it came ashore as a Category 4 hurricane. And that means, in this case, the winds sustained were about 140 miles an hour. And from there, it tracked up through Georgia and sort of went a little bit westerly to be in the North Carolina mountains, the Appalachian range, and Tennessee got a good soaking, but the mountains of North Carolina has really grabbed the attention as we do this recording. That's where the most death has occurred. The images that we're seeing come out, they're heartbreaking and they are catastrophic. It really is something you don't see very often, and the mountains certainly would not see that kind of rainfall. But they had places where it was measured at, many places measured at about 24 inches, 2 feet. and there were some that were over 30 inches. And so it is usually in the eastern part of the state, there are flat lands, and so you get a lot of rain, and it kind of just puddles up and sits or gets in the rivers and moves. In the mountains, it's hills. So when it moves, it's going to move pretty fast. And that has wiped out some small communities.
And what are some of the specific damages that these areas are facing?
Well, the Asheville, which is in Buncombe County, and Asheville is the most populous city in western North Carolina. It's just under 100,000. It was only accessible by air for a few days. There is roads open now. A mudslide had closed one interstate. Another interstate that runs to Tennessee, part of it fell into the Pigeon River. That's going to be a long-term replacement deal there. But the biggest, there's lots of challenges with infrastructure in total. As we record last night, there were 500 roads that were closed because of Helene in the state. That was actually up from 400 earlier in the day, just over 400. So things have been happening as recovery is happening. That number had been up. It come down. Last night at over 500 was the highest I'd seen it since the hurricane happened. Part of that could be that they're finally getting into some of the reaches that they couldn't get into earlier. Asheville's water system has been compromised greatly. Infrastructure in terms of communications has been greatly damaged. The major carriers, I think they're at about 60% or better getting recovered and everything. But you had cell towers that actually went down. They toppled. So it has been an enormous challenge there. We're seeing all kinds of ways that people are getting found or rescued. They've used canines. I saw a clip this morning on social media where a pilot of a helicopter found somebody because they were using a mirror out in a grassy field. There's stories of using mules to carry supplies to some of these areas because there is no road or the road's, muddied out or whatever. Supplies meaning food and things, but also medicine like insulin. It is truly catastrophic and something you just don't see every day.
What are some of the ways that states are kind of coming together to help these places?
Well, there's been a number of states, as typically happens with a hurricane or something. You'll have a lot of utility organizations and things like that that'll send crews and that kind of thing. Specifically, the Center Square had a story this week where the Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, he was in one of the hardest hit areas, and he's got some kind of crew operation that can go and build temporary bridges and that kind of thing. He said, we don't need them. They need them in North Carolina. Send them up there. And they did. Alabama's Kay Ivey, the governor there, she has sent help this way. There was a flight crew out of Ohio. Those stories are on thecentersquare.com. There's been a lot of outreach in that regard. As we record, I know there's at least over 170 deaths, and the number's likely to go up, and that's top 6 for the last 3/4 of a century for a deadly storm.
And a North Carolina senator made a well-placed call to get some help. Tell us about that.
Well, that would be Danny Britt. And Danny is, he's a good dude. He is from Lumberton, Robeson County. And Lumberton is a town on I-95 that runs from Florida to Maine. And it's about 20 or 30 miles from the border of South Carolina. And Lumberton sits low. The Lumber River runs through it, and it floods like nobody's business when there's hurricanes. And that area got crippled badly, still recovering even today from hurricanes in 2016 and 2018. It's Florence and Matthew. So Danny put a call into Donald Trump and said, we don't have communications out there. What can we do to speed this up? And so, as you probably know, Donald Trump had a fireside conversation, as it were, with Elon Musk earlier. They're buddies. He calls Elon Musk. Elon Musk has Starlink, which is part of his SpaceX operation. And he said, I'll give you all you need. And so they did get communications back going as the major carriers are still getting their things together. So just a case of knowing where to call. I mean, there was nothing wrong with Governor Roy Cooper calling President Biden asking for FEMA help. That's what you're supposed to do. Danny knew Donald Trump needed a favor, and that's what you're supposed to do. Hey, can you help us? So that was that was pretty cool to see. You know, the one thing that we have seen in North Carolina, hurricanes before, we've seen so many times that people in the mountains, people from other states would come and help Eastern North Carolina recover and get going. And I live in Eastern North Carolina, and I have seen that 10 times over. Going back this time, it's like it's our turn now, and people are stepping up and they're helping. It's not a short-term recovery. It wasn't 25 years ago here for Floyd. It certainly won't be for this storm for the mountains. There is a lot of work to be done, and I know the resources and the supplies and the love and the prayers are going to come for those folks, and that'll be a good thing. But it's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah, it's great to see the way people really come together for these sorts of things. President Biden also recently visited the region. Can you tell us about his visit?
Yeah, he came on Wednesday, and South Carolina also had, I think, a couple of dozen deaths, as did Georgia. So he landed in South Carolina and got some briefing there, went to Raleigh, was briefed at the emergency operations. With so many roads out, I mean, they couldn't handle his motorcade, and he had said he wanted to stay out of the way anyway, didn't want to get in the way of what was going on to help. So he took an aerial tour, as a number of state lawmakers and all have done during the week, and he saw a lot of devastation. It was good that he came. I know presidents always get critiqued, rightly or wrongly, on whether they go to areas that are impacted by catastrophes like this. It's kind of a hard deal. You know, you don't want to get in the way, but you want to show compassion. So, but he upped the federal disaster declaration on Wednesday also for North Carolina, for Georgia, and for Florida. So there's more help hopefully coming for those folks. But it was good to see that he's been there. It's good to see that Donald Trump has been in some of the areas that have been hit. Kamala Harris has done that. You know, the leaders are, you know, showing that they're concerned, and people appreciate that. They've got bigger things to worry about than a politician coming to see them, but they do appreciate the love and support.
Well, Alan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Alan. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the dock worker strike, we'll go back to Dan McCaleb.
Last night, Thursday night, about 50,000 dock workers who work at ports on the East and Gulf Coast tentatively agreed to a settlement for a new contract, at least for the time being, ending what had been a 3-day strike that threatened supply chains, potentially could have led to much higher consumer costs. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, tell us about this tentative agreement and what the strike meant and could have meant.
Sure. I mean, it's hard to overstate the significance both of the strike and the impact it could have had on the U.S. economy and the deal that was reached by the parties involved. I would say that we saw that they received tentatively a 62% pay increase.
I think that's over 6 years, I think, right?
Over 5 or 6 years. Yeah. I mean, so it's spread out, but even still, I mean, you know, it's still more than the average worker is getting, to be sure. So it's a generous pay increase. Another big sticking point in this negotiation has been automation, Dan, because automation has been increasing in many of these ports, and the workers are of course, very threatened by this. And so they wanted in the deal promises, even legally binding promises, that automation would not replace their jobs. Now, we haven't seen really the details of that part of the deal come out, but I think that's the part that's going to be worked out. The workers must have gotten at least enough concessions to feel comfortable returning to work as they did Thursday night. So automation is going to be dampened at least for the next few years, assuming that this all doesn't fall through. They pushed the new deadline for all this. The suspension goes through January, which is great news for Vice President Kamala Harris, who is running for president, of course. This October negotiations were a worst case scenario for her. So she's got to be breathing a sigh of relief this morning.
Right. So dock workers are returning to work as early as today, although some ports have said that they'll need at least 24 hours to gear up operations. So over the next couple of days, most of the ports should reopen. Of course, they're 3 days behind because of the 3-day strike. So not sure what that's going to mean in the immediate aftermath of the tentative settlement, but they will go back to work until January 15th, assuming that they can finalize the terms of this contract. As you mentioned, automation is a big part of it. I think they were still working out those details. But Casey, during the course of this strike, a lot of interesting information was coming out, including what, dock workers currently make before they got this 60+% pay raise over the 6-year period. More than half, for example, that as the Center Square reported, more than half of 3,700 dock workers at the Port of New York and New Jersey earned more than $150,000 in the fiscal year. The median income across the United States is $74,000. They were making good money. Now, that did include overtime. So that was not their base wage. That included overtime. But I think many Americans would argue, hey, they're pretty well compensated already.
Yeah, I mean, it's, of course, that's higher. Both of those figures are much higher than the median salary in the U.S., which I believe is between $50,000 and $60,000. Of course, the cost of living is higher in the Northeast. But one thing that was not as well reported is there was kind of a wide disparity. Dock workers in Texas are making a lot less than some of these in the Northeast. And so they're not all making the same amount. And so these raises are going to impact them differently. But it's a powerful union, of course, as we saw, almost brought the U.S. economy to its knees. And so when you have that amount of power, you're going to get these raises. I mean, that's what these unions can do. And they knew that now was the time to do it because Biden is self-proclaimed most pro-union president in history. Now, whether that's really true historically, who knows? But he has been vocally pro-union. So if you're going to do a strike that shuts down the U.S. economy, there were groups that I was as I was reporting on this, groups that were saying that this would be worse than the COVID-19 pandemic supply chain issues. I mean, we didn't really experience the fullness of it because it was, the strike was aborted. But if this had gone on for a few weeks, Dan, we're talking shortages. We're talking huge price increases like we saw during COVID and after COVID. So, I mean, like I said, it's hard to overstate how big a deal this was and could have been for the economy going into really the holiday season as well. So, but Biden was the time to do it. He's a union guy. They got what they wanted. It helps you as economy, but it is a tentative deal. I just want to reemphasize that, which means it could fall through at any moment if they catch wind, or they change their mind, or internally the workers want more. That's the other side of this. It's kind of like when the president ratifies a deal, agrees to a deal, the Senate has to ratify it. These union deals can be like that. If the workers aren't happy or something comes up to make them not happy, they can still kill it. And man, if they killed it 3 weeks before Election Day, they would really have the administration right where they wanted at the bargaining table.
Just briefly, Casey, in the limited time we have left, of course, you mentioned the supply chain issues in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Reports of people hoarding all kinds of products, including toilet paper. I've seen reports of the same thing happening in this past week. Here, of course, toilet paper is made in the U.S. She's shipped across the country by truck, not by ship, not coming in from, Europe, South America, etc., other trade partners with the U.S. So it was, I don't know if I want to call it amusing or not to hear those reports because it just wasn't necessary for that. We're talking about goods that are shipped in from overseas. Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What is the latest on the upcoming trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan? What long-term effects has the COVID-19 pandemic had on school enrollment? And are tariffs an effective economic bargaining chip? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Ryan Wesley Ruth, 58, pleaded not guilty to charges of attempted assassination of a presidential candidate after being accused of stalking former President Donald Trump and building a sniper's nest near Trump's West Palm Beach golf course. Ruth, who most recently lived in Hawaii, also faces federal charges of possessing a firearm as a felon and possessing a firearm with an obliterated serial number. He waived the formal reading of the indictment and entered his plea on Monday. More than 660,000 criminal foreign nationals identified for deportation by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, are currently living in communities across the United States. This includes individuals convicted or charged with violent crimes such as homicide, sexual assault, and kidnapping. ICE Deputy Director Patrick Lechleitner revealed that as of July 21, 2024, 662,566 non-citizens with criminal histories are on ICE's national docket. Of these, 435,719 have been convicted, while 226,847 face pending criminal charges. Approaching the one-year anniversary of the October 7th terrorist attacks against Israel, Project Dynamo has issued a warning about anti-Semitism-related threats in the U.S. The veteran-led Tampa-based Project Dynamo is responsible for numerous rescue missions, including evacuating hundreds of Americans from Israel. It says it is alarmed by the rising tide of open and brazen protests against Jews and Jewish communities over the past year. With the anniversary of the attack looming, they warn Jewish communities to remain vigilant and aware of potential threats. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has refused to resign after being indicted on federal charges last week, despite growing pressure from fellow Democrats. Adams pleaded not guilty to a 5-count indictment accusing him of bribery, fraud, and campaign finance violations, marking the first time a sitting New York City mayor has faced criminal charges. Prosecutors allege Adams accepted over $100,000 in illegal gifts, including travel and campaign contributions from the Turkish government and foreign business owners dating back to his time as a Brooklyn borough president, along with over $10 million in illegal straw donations linked to Turkey. The U.S. House Oversight Committee has investigated why the Federal Communications Commission's fast-tracked a deal allowing billionaire Democrat donor George Soros to acquire a large number of commercial radio stations here in the U.S. just weeks before the presidential election. The radio broadcast company Odyssey fell into financial straits, but through a complex business deal, Democratic mega-donor and billionaire George Soros has gained control of the 220 stations in 47 U.S. markets. Odyssey is the second largest radio station in the United States. Deals of this size require FCC approval, but in this case, the FCC expedited the approval process. As Arizona faces the possibility of flipping to a Democrat majority in the upcoming election, groups such as the Arizona Free Enterprise Clubs are pushing back against potential changes. The group has launched the Don't California My Arizona campaign, aiming to educate voters on Democratic proposed policies they claim mirror those already in effect in California. Their concerns focus on legislation related to border security, taxpayer cost, and climate policy. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the corruption trial from Illinois, we'll go back to Dan McCaleb.
We are now just days away from the long-anticipated trial of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. The judge in the case denied motions this week to dismiss some of the charges against Madigan and to separate co-defendant Michael McLean's trial from Madigan's. Joining me to discuss this is Greg Bishop, Illinois Associate Editor. Greg, you covered Madigan's tenure as Speaker for a number of years before he was forced out in 2021. The day's come. What do you make of it?
You know, it has been a long time coming, especially since the Speaker had been the Speaker for all but 2 years from 1983 to 2021. I mean, that is one heck of a run, let alone he was in the House for 50 years. But it wasn't just his role as a state representative or as the longtime House Speaker controlling what comes up in the House. It was also his role as the Democratic Party of Illinois' executive director. So he had a nexus of power, not only controlling what happened in the House, but also which Democrats were going to get party dollars for their races every 2 years. So you can imagine that itself, that nexus of power, really lend it to his ability to pull favors, to get things passed, and to march an agenda forward. Now, federal prosecutors say that they investigated for 9 years what they called Madigan Enterprise, revealing that the allegations against the speaker, 22 counts, where he tried to benefit himself and his associates in exchange for favorable legislation to help the state's largest utility, Commonwealth Edison. So yeah, it's been a long time coming, and we fully anticipate to staff the hearing to get out all of the evidence because, Dan, as it was with the ComEd 4 hearing, it was fascinating to see and to hear undercover wiretap recordings, undercover video recordings of these individuals talking about getting do-nothing jobs for their friends from ComEd. For every summer, they would need X number of jobs. So these types of things, pretty revealing in how government can be abused.
Yeah, speaking of the evidence, Greg, they expect the trial could last up to 10 weeks. That's a whole lot of evidence, so it will be interesting what new, whether it be wiretap data or whatever that we got to listen to for the ComEd 4 trial last year, what new evidence they present. Let's talk about the motions that were denied here this week. McClain and his attorneys wanted to separate his trial from Madigan's. They're going to stand on trial together beginning next week because the judge denied that motion, but he wanted to separate the trial because they expect Madigan and Madigan's attorneys to blame McClain for essentially the corruption. Judge said no, not going to happen. That's only a theory. At this point, they're going to stand trial together. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and listen, I mean, the ComEd 4 trial, McClain was a major role in all of that. A lot of the evidence wasn't solely about McClain, but he was featured in quite a bit of it, from phone calls to conversations on video at a restaurant where he's talking about deals. And setting up these do-nothing jobs and talking about our friend, which was a reference to Madigan. He'd call people up and, say things like, our friend wouldn't like that, or our friend is more favorable on this thing or that thing. And even the conversations that weren't necessarily about jobs, but about the political inner workings that were revealed during the ComEd 4 trial, showing that McClain really acted as almost like this middleman between Madigan and those who were making decisions for ComEd. So clearly McClain is central to this, just as central as Madigan. And I think the judge saw that and said, well, you've got to have this all together here. But some of the other things that Madigan has tried to get the judge to agree with, the judge just hasn't agreed with, including bringing in a political professor who understands the Chicago political machine. While he's going to be allowed to testify, he'll have to narrow his testimony a bit. But there's also just been a lot of publicity heading up to this, and we fully anticipate a lot of fireworks in that courtroom as Madigan will be there, McClain will be there, the federal prosecutors will be there with all of those receipts.
That's right. Now, Madigan is 82 years old. Now, Greg, if he's convicted and sentenced to time in prison, that could be the rest of his life. Is his age any consideration here?
If there was a conviction, again, it's possibly going to be a 10-week sentence. So, here we are. We've got 30 days until the November election. The verdict, whichever way it goes, is going to come out afterwards. So I imagine that if the verdict comes back guilty, you'd have a sentencing phase. There could be, the sentencing is going to be postponed pending an appeal. So I imagine that there's going to be a lot of different ways that Madigan may try to extend his freedom, so to speak. But if any indication is that the evidence in the ComEd 4 trial was as damning as it was, and if we see similar types of evidence, I imagine a jury is going to hear that with wide eyes open.
And as you mentioned, Greg, the center square will be in the courthouse covering the trial. 10 weeks, that's a long time. We'll see if it actually goes that way. But listeners can follow all of our coverage at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Greg. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the continuing effects of the pandemic on school enrollment, let's now turn to Eliana Kernodle.
New research shows that school enrollment has declined in over 5,000 public schools in the U.S., suggesting families are rejecting traditional schools because of the pandemic. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, a Fordham Institute report took a look at enrollment numbers. What did they find, and what explanations are they offering?
Yeah, so what they basically found was that school districts, thousands of public schools, 5,000 public schools in the U.S., have seen enrollment declines, and that those are not random. So I spoke to Sophocles Goulas, who is the researcher from the Brookings Institution, who partnered with the Fordham Institute to do this. And he said his background is as an economist, and he approaches these issues from that perspective. And essentially what he found was that this isn't, something random, that the students were more likely to leave these schools that were underperforming, right? So what that means is kind of complicated because, underperforming schools, there are metrics that you can use to try to evaluate those, but it varies from state to state. So I think you kind of have to try your best and take that, with that sort of little asterisk there saying like, we're not, it's not like saying that every school that's underperforming is a bad school, but, according to the state's metrics, different kinds of metrics, that it's, not doing as well as other schools. And so there's, different ways to measure that. And that, again, varies a little bit. But essentially that students in those schools that were designated as underperforming were more likely to see these large enrollment declines. And so what Goulas said to me about his research was that these are not random, that we're finding that the big low-performing schools experience larger enrollment declines, which makes us think that families are looking for alternatives. And so basically he said that this is a pandemic story. This is a COVID-19 story, and that we're still seeing the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic through school choice. And it was very interesting. He's like, we don't know where the students are going yet. He said, we're not seeing that like an uptick in private schools or charter schools. He said it might be homeschooling, but we're kind of waiting on some data to drop from the federal government. And I think that's how you're talking to like a real researcher, when they're like, well, we're waiting for the latest to drop from this one government, education data, publisher. Like we're waiting for the new round of information to come out, which was just great. I love kind of hearing people who are so into like, we know that this is coming, but we don't have it yet. So he said that might explain what's going on, but we're not exactly sure. And, one of the things that he pointed out was that there was learning loss, a lot of learning loss during the pandemic. And so maybe families are looking at their public school and they're saying, oh man, my student is a year behind where they should be, or where they were before the pandemic. We're looking at this and my kid can't read, or my kid is way behind in math. I need to do something else. And he said, we're not sure, if homeschooling is going to be up to the challenge, or these different alternatives where these kids is going to be up to the challenge to get them back. But, families seem to be looking for that kind of option for something else. And also he mentioned, there was different arrangements because of the school closures. Kids were at home and they were trying that. And so for some families that might have worked better, instead of getting to the bus stop or driving the kids to school, being home all the time was a better arrangement, and maybe it worked better for everybody. So he just said, by necessity, families were experimenting during COVID-19, and not necessarily by choice at the time, but now they have that flexibility of, do I want to go back to that in-person school? And then I think really when you kind of pair that with some of these underperforming schools, that becomes kind of the question, right? Of like, well, am I going to do a better job at home? I mean, I think, and I'm kind of adding this in here and sort of filling in the gap, but like, am I doing a better job here at home than maybe that local neighborhood school district that is not serving all students well? And that's something that Goulas said, is that even, these low performing schools do serve some students perhaps adequately. So it's kind of, again, hard to tell, it's sort of hard to define the low performing school. But that, in a nutshell, that's kind of what the research is asking, according to, the researcher who was saying, this raises a lot of interesting questions. We don't have all the answers yet, but still it's very important to sort of raise the question of where are students going if they're not at these public schools. And
how is this connected to school closures?
Right. So, I mean, if you have a lot of enrollment decline, historically, Goulas told me, that the enrollment decline is associated with school closures. And so it's not all the time, but it does start, bringing up the question of like, well, okay, if we have thousands of students missing from a school district, or specifically thousands of students are missing from perhaps a local, like a low performing school, do we need to close that school? And that starts raising the blood pressure for school board members, for superintendents, because nobody wants to see, a local neighborhood school get closed, because, those families are going to be having to drive a lot farther. And, it really pulls, that infrastructure out of a community. And so it really is an impactful event, and it gets a lot of people very worked up. And of course, teachers unions are very involved in those kinds of discussions as well, because that's a lot of staff, that's buses. A lot of different kinds of things have to be moved around. So it is a very big deal, and especially within school ecosystems, especially when there are these school closures. And as Gul said, that they're associated with that declining enrollment. But, for him, it was important to ask the question, to try to figure out, okay, where are we in the process? Because, if you don't close the schools, you're trying to keep them open, and your communities are paying a lot of money, your taxpayers are paying a lot of money to try to basically keep the lights on in these mostly empty buildings. And that is not economical. That's not a good use of a district's resources. So you kind of have that balance there. And really, Gula said, what you need is to analyze the situation for that school district. So a superintendent would have to look and say, what are the needs of the community? What is our enrollment now? Has there been a decline? How much? What can we expect in terms of the future? And it's very interesting. A lot of these school districts are thinking ahead and saying, what is the birth rate in our county? Like, how many students can we reasonably expect to have in 5 years? And a lot of these school districts across the country, large school districts, are seeing like there are declining birth rates. Like, that is going to be a part of the conversation for a lot of school districts in the near future, is people are having fewer children. How does that translate to our budgets? It's going to, we're going to have to close schools. We're going to have to move things around and as Gula said, right size things.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour, and I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to dig into the role of tariffs in economic negotiation. It's PhD economist, Dr. Orfe Divounguy. Dr. O, John Deere, probably one of the most storied American manufacturers, the largest maker of farm equipment and lawn and garden equipment, in U.S. history.
In business since 1837.
Yeah, they've been making stuff.
The world's largest tractor manufacturer.
They've been making stuff that helps America grow crops and mow lawns since before the Civil War, right? Business pressures against John Deere have been real, as they have been for virtually every other heavy equipment manufacturer of heavy goods in the United States. But they're talking about moving, first of all, they're laying off people, here in the U.S. And they're talking about shifting production to Mexico. And former President Donald Trump hopped in this week in one of his speeches, said, if John Deere does that, that he's going to impose a 200% tariff on any foreign manufactured John Deere equipment that's, attempted to be brought back into the United States. I wanted to get your take on that, specifically on the threat that a tariff will be implemented if they try to go that route. And then let's see if we can bring this around to a discussion about using the threat of a tariff to bargain.
Look, a company like John Deere has 25% share of global agricultural equipment, right? 40%, nearly half of the North American market. Just think about this, man. What is he thinking? They're just too big. They're just too strong. It's just going to hurt a lot of people. It's going to hurt a lot of Americans because basically tariffs raise the price of everything. It's going to hurt American workers. So I don't think this is the way to do it. Resources will flow to where they are the most productive. And the best way to keep John Deere right here in the USA is to make it easy for them to do business right here in the USA. It's not by imposing tariffs.
Right.
That would be my answer.
Okay. And I think that's the correct answer. My thought is that this is a business negotiation that's happening out loud, and this is the start of it. And in business negotiations, sometimes the voices are louder, certainly at the beginning. I would suspect that we will not get to the point where the tariffs would need to be implemented, that this is a precursor to a negotiation, and that Trump, if elected, has opened negotiations basically with John Deere to keep those manufacturing jobs in the United States. And so what we have at the beginning is an equal opposite reaction to the news that John Deere would like to move some portion of its production across the border to Mexico.
I get that Trump likes to use things as, what's that book he wrote?
Art of the Deal.
Art of the Deal, right?
Yeah.
He likes to put these threats out there that he will never actually follow through on, right? But ultimately, I think a lot of people are starting to see through that. At some point, people start to call you bluff, right?
Sure.
And I think that's starting to happen, and the more he does it, the less serious people will think he is. And then the problem with that is that it then potentially could escalate into him doing something drastic to get people to take him seriously again.
Like actually impose the tariff.
Which
he may do. I mean, that is not outside the realm of possibilities if it doesn't go the way that he would like it to go. I mean, I think he probably would. And I think that that's what makes him an interesting negotiator and potentially makes his strategy of the threat of a tariff maybe a little bit more real than some other politicians in the United States and other past presidents. At the end of the day, I don't think anybody in the United States wants John Deere to move production of anything outside of the United States. I don't think that they do. And I don't know that necessarily that John Deere wants to move production outside of the United States. So this could be the stairway to some other kind of deal that allows manufacturing of John Deere's product line to remain in the United States.
Totally. But you know what you see like these individual deals with individual companies.
Right.
That is just terrible, right? We did a whole podcast episode on corruption. Why not just level the playing field?
But to your point, right? When you have that much market share and you are that relevant of a player in any segment, I think that you do have something of an equal footing with regard to the ability to manage your business inside of, the reality of what the government would like to happen. Neither the candidates, neither Harris nor Trump wants any more jobs going across our border.
Of course not. I mean, the reality is it would actually hurt the U.S. economy, hurt consumers, lower economic growth, result in higher prices, higher interest rates.
If a deal could not be reached.
Well, yeah, I'm not talking about just John Deere here. I'm talking about just tariffs. The idea that he would impose tariffs on large parts of the U.S. economy would be disastrous for the people that he's supposedly championing.
Sure.
And so I don't think anyone wants this to happen. But again, the only way to really prevent this from happening is by just making it easy for people to do business in the United States.
Right. Thank you for joining us, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Curdodal. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.